Much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak on this bill as an enthusiastic student of electoral systems. I think it was about 1998. I think it was that I did a Polls 206 at Victoria University, a course taken by Professor Nigel Roberts, in which he went through all of the different electoral systems that were on offer last time New Zealand discussed this, and transposed historical election data and tried to kind of interpret, if those systems had been operating in those historical elections, what would the outcomes have been? And it was a really interesting paper, and it would be fair to say that it captured my attention for the whole semester, even though the nature of the topic is something other people would find very dry. It's fair to say I think the New Zealand public are being presented with an exciting array of options in this coming referendum, and I'll talk about a few of those in a moment. I think just going back to the history of how we ended up with MMP in the first place, I think much has been written, and many people have commented on the fact that it was almost like a vengeance from the voters who were unhappy with the way Parliament had been behaving. Laws had been passed without the consent, if you like, or the implied consent of the majority of the New Zealand public, at odds with public opinion, and it was almost like MMP was adopted as a way of trying to slow Parliament down and bring Parliament back under the control of the people. And I think it's done that to a large extent. We don't have the very rapid laws being passed through Parliament now that we did under First Past the Post. Having said that, there are a few exceptions, and we've seen some in the short period of time that I have been in this Parliament. But overall, I think MMP has led to a slower parliamentary process, a process that's more responsive overall to the views of all New Zealanders. It's also led to a much more diverse and representative Parliament, and we see that when we look around the debating chamber now. We have parties represented in Parliament that were not here prior to MMP. We have ethnic minority groups that are now represented in Parliament that were not here prior to MMP. So there's a lot at stake in terms of what a change might mean for the way Parliament functions and what Parliament actually consists of. I would say overall, however, that I think changing the electoral system isn't the most pressing constitutional issue that we have. And if we go back to that idea of voters' vengeance, which was one of the books that was written about the MMP election in referendum in 1993, it was called Voters' Vengeance. If we go back to that idea, one of the concerns was that Parliament rapidly passed all this legislation which the public didn't necessarily support. And we can do things that, I guess, place more of a check on this House. We have a very simple representative democracy here in this Parliament. There are very few constraints on what this House can actually do. If we're talking about constitutional reform, that's something that we might want to talk about, whether, in fact, for example, in the use of parliamentary urgency, should there be criteria that need to be met. I would argue that's actually a more significant constitutional discussion for us to have than changing the electoral system that determines how we end up getting to this place in the first place. And I do concede to Dr Mapp that having question time when Parliament is urgency is a good innovation, and I congratulate the government for doing that. Coming back to MMP, however, I am concerned that the MMP and this referendum, the concern that I have is that the review of MMP will only be undertaken if the majority of people vote in the first referendum to keep MMP. I think that's disappointing. I'd like to see the review of MMP happen anyway, regardless of what the outcome of that referendum is, because I think even if we get to a second referendum where MMP is traded off against another system, I think it would be good for voters to know what voting to keep MMP would actually entail. And I think that there are improvements that can be made to the MMP electoral system that will make it, that will alleviate some of the public's concerns and that will make them more inclined to want to keep it. And they should know that before they have to vote on both the first and the second referendum. So I would argue that we should do that review of MMP as soon as possible, but certainly before the referendums are undertaken. I want to turn now to before I turn to the menu of options that the voters are going to be given, I just want to briefly talk about the rules around regulating what campaigners can spend on this referendum. And I want to particularly take exception with some of the examples that John Boscawen used in his speech when he talked about the amount of money political parties have spent in general election campaigns, because the nature of a general election campaign is very different. You've got a wide array of candidates campaigning across a wide range of issues, and so the amount of money and the volume of activity is much wider than in a referendum. In a referendum, it's a specific issue. It's usually a very limited number of choices. The debate is very limited in terms of what's covered. So a smaller spending limit for those is very reasonable and very relevant. And to try and compare the spending limit on a referendum with the spending limit for a political party in a campaign, I think is a little bit unfair. I was amused by Mr Boscawen's reference to the Auckland mayoral election, and almost by inference, he seemed to be arguing that the candidates on the right needed a higher spending limit because they ran worse campaigns than the candidates on the left in the Auckland local body election campaigns. I'd simply say that people didn't vote for John Banks because they didn't want him, not necessarily because of the quality of his television advertisements or lack thereof. I move now to the menu of options that the voters are going to be given. Should they choose to remove MMP and adopt an alternative system. There is the obvious return to the first-past-the-post electoral system, which all New Zealanders are very familiar with. It's a system we had prior to 1996. My concern about that, of course, is I think it would result in a real loss of the minority voices that we see in the House at the moment. We then have the preferential vote system, which we saw in operation in the Wellington mayoral election, where we had a National Party candidate argue that because she got more first preference votes she should still be the mayor, even though the candidate who actually did end up winning got more second and third preference votes and ended up defeating her on that. That was that preferential vote, and she had won through that method herself in previous elections. So the voters of Wellington will know what the preferential voting system looks like because they use it for their mayoral elections, and I know that a number of other territorial local authorities use a preferential voting system. There's the single standard transferable vote system, again where the candidates are ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on. The difference in the standard transferable vote system is where just hold on to your hat for just a moment. The difference here with the standard transferable vote system is the electorates are much larger and there are multiple members for an electorate. And I think one of the public's concerns about that kind of system would be they like to know who their representative in Parliament actually is. And one of the concerns about list members of Parliament, I'm sure we all hear it from time to time, is that they're not accountable directly to an electorate. Now, whether anybody agrees with that or not, I'll get into it in some more detail. Wainwright's very impatient, but I'm going to get into some more detail. So basically, under the single standard transferable vote system, all of the candidates are ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. In order to be elected to Parliament, and again the threshold will differ depending on the size of the electorate, they will have to receive a certain number of first preference votes. If they get that on the first preference, then they become a member of Parliament, and that's going to the number of first preference votes they need would differ depending on the size of the electorate. If at the end of that allocation of first preference seats there are still vacant seats, then the lowest polling candidates drop out, their second preferences are reallocated, and if somebody based on that then receives enough votes, then they get the next spot. But what it means though is that the constituencies have multiple members of Parliament. And so rather than there being a single representative for an area, there might be multiple representatives. So finally, that's not a bad explanation. There is the last, which is the supplementary member. I would call that first past the post with a winner's bonus, and I know that's the system that the National Party seem to be, or the John Key seems to be leaning towards. I don't necessarily support that. If you look at what supplementary member would have done under MMP elections, it could have dramatically altered the outcome of some of those MMP elections. Of course, voter behaviour may well change depending on a change in the electoral system. We can't just assume that if the electoral system is different, that the voters will behave the same way. And of course, campaigns are run differently. We see National and Labour campaigning under MMP in areas that they didn't campaign in before, because under first past the post there was no value in doing so. So voter behaviour could well change. Overall, I think that I'll probably leave it at that, seeing as my time has expired.